This week, Microsoft fixes more than 100 security vulnerabilities, including 2 0 days. The search highlight feature finally comes to Windows 10 for everybody. Some Jira and Confluence customers in the cloud are still experiencing complete block of access to their data. Microsoft is finally bringing privileged access management to Windows via Endpoint Manager. And Microsoft might be in hot water again with anti-competitive behavior with their licensing model for use of Windows in the cloud. So let's start off with the Patch Tuesday updates that were released earlier this week. Now, there were quite a lot of security vulnerabilities patched, so 120 of them in total, including 2 0-day elevation of privilege vulnerabilities. Now, while of course, that's all very interesting, I'm not going to bore you with the details because you can go and look for yourself, but there are some interesting things that did happen as part of this update. So for Windows 11, it's now possible for the operating system to display up to 4 priority notifications. One interesting thing that I'm not quite sure of what they're actually fixing here by the wording of it, but it's always been a problem when you start to rename a file in Explorer that's synchronized with OneDrive, that if you start to rename it, by pressing F2 or whatever, you start typing and suddenly it will just flip off and stop you from being able to rename it mid-process, and that's always been very annoying. Now, Microsoft says in this update that they fixed an issue that would cause OneDrive to lose focus after you rename it. So I'm not quite sure what they mean by that, but I really hope they fix that very annoying issue with OneDrive sync. So anyway, time will tell whether that's really the case. And the search highlights feature, the update to search in Windows 10, has now reached general availability. So I think that was in preview for about 2 months. That's not coming to Windows 11 at this moment in time, but Microsoft has said that they will be integrating this new search highlights feature into Windows 11 as well at some point in the future. Now, this is a really interesting one. So the company that owns Jira and Confluence, Atlasian, suffered a cloud outage about 2 weeks ago, I think, since April the 4th, and it affects about 400 of its customers and their access to the cloud services. Now, basically what happened, and this is very interesting, there was some maintenance that was due to be performed on those cloud services on April the 4th, and since that happened, these customers haven't been able to access their data. Now, the maintenance was supposed to delete legacy data from these cloud systems, but ended up also deleting live data. Now, about 45% of the companies that have been affected have since April the 4th had access to their data restored, but Atlassian says it's going to take up to another 2 weeks to restore the data to those remaining companies. So this is quite an incredible thing. It's going to be almost a month where some of those companies affected won't have been able to access Jira or Confluence if they're using those services in the cloud. Now, if you remember back to last week, there was a Windows hybrid work event where Microsoft basically talked about some new features that will come into Windows 11 and some of its other products like Endpoint Manager. Now, it's interesting this week that I found a blog post that really expanded on that announcement and detailed some features which Microsoft hadn't really talked about at all during that event. And some of them were quite important. And I want to highlight one of them in particular today, and that is that after, however many years Windows has existed, Microsoft is finally bringing privilege management to Windows via Endpoint Manager. Now, what do I mean by privilege management? So I mean privileged access management. So at the moment you have user account control in Windows, and this allows users to run as a standard user but choose for themselves when they would like to elevate to administrative privileges. Now, that's a problem for organizations because obviously they can't control when users decide to do that or not do it. Now, privileged access management solutions put that power into the hands of the organization. Now, there are various solutions from companies like Beyond Trust, third-party solutions, of course, which you can buy in order to add that functionality to Windows. But of course, you need to pay for it, and many companies do indeed pay for it and add that feature. Now, it's really important, of course, because a lot of the vulnerabilities that affect Windows aren't necessarily a big problem if you're running as a standard user. At least you have, how to describe it, much bigger damage limitation if you're running as a standard user. But even if you're running as a protected administrator under user account control, there are quite a few ways in which, hackers can craftily find their way around that protection. It's not a security boundary, it's just like a seatbelt. It's designed to be a protection rather than an actual security boundary. So I'm really excited about this feature. Of course, it's not going to be something that you can access for free within Windows. You are going to need to have a subscription that gives you access to Endpoint Manager, but it is going to allow admins to set rules and elevate standard user permissions so that users will be able to perform certain admin level tasks on a temporary basis. And that's something Microsoft itself has never brought before to Windows. So I think that's a really, really important piece of news. Of course, the third-party solutions from the likes of Beyond Trust are likely to still provide a better solution than whatever Microsoft will give us. We've yet to see this in action, but I'm really excited to see that, and I'm sure we'll be covering that on Petri as soon as it goes into preview. There are a couple of other things that were announced in this blog post, like some updates to Microsoft Tunnel, which is a VPN solution, I think mainly designed for Android and mobile devices. They're giving also admins the ability to deploy certificates directly from Endpoint Manager, so that's also going to be a very useful feature. This week it was also revealed that some of Microsoft's customers and its biggest rivals in the cloud space like Amazon and Google are criticizing practices where Microsoft is making it prohibitively expensive to run Windows or Microsoft applications in those competing cloud platforms, and even sometimes impossible. So for instance, Microsoft is saying in some situations, well, you use Windows 365, our Windows-based cloud PC, or nothing at all. Now, what's really interesting about this is that Brad Smith, in an interview with Bloomberg, said, well, actually at Microsoft we kind of agree with that, and we need to look at what we're doing more carefully to make sure that everything is a little bit fairer. Now, I'm not sure, of course, this is a tactic that Microsoft is using to win as much of the cloud space in different areas that it can, and of course it seems reasonable that it might, try to make Windows cheaper to run on Azure or its Office applications or whatever else. But at the end of the day, this could lead to more antitrust actions against Microsoft. So they're going to have to look at what the competitors are saying and avoid that risk of more anti-competitive actions in the courts, of course. So we'll see how all of that pans out, and it seems a reasonable complaint from the other cloud competitors. Although it's interesting, there are some things like Windows 365 and a proper Windows desktop that, as far as I know, has always been the case that if you want to run a real Windows desktop, you can only do that on a Microsoft platform. So now, of course, you have Windows 365, which is really, maybe with the exception of Azure Virtual Desktop, the only other way you can run a genuine Windows desktop using, remote desktop technology in the cloud. If you're going to run a Windows desktop on Amazon or Google, what you're actually going to get is the Windows desktop experience in Windows Server, because I believe that Microsoft just doesn't allow licensing of that on other platforms other than its own. But that's not a new thing. That's been the case since, the dawn of time, basically. So if you want an actual genuine Windows experience, then you basically have to go with Microsoft's own technologies. It'll be interesting to see whether they're forced to change that as part of these complaints. But nothing's really happening at the moment, but it could, of course, lead to action. So if you're wondering what the difference between the Windows Server desktop experience is and the real Windows desktop, there are subtle differences. The difference isn't massive. Of course, what you see is mainly the same, but there are some important differences. So for instance, you don't get to run Microsoft Edge unless you're running maybe Windows Server 2022. That might have changed already, I'm not sure. But that was one of the big differences. You were basically stuck with Internet Explorer. And there were some other things, I think, like the Microsoft Store is not included in the desktop experience, in the Windows desktop experience for server, and there are some other differences that do make it not quite the same thing as running, a client version of Windows, which is what you get with Windows 365. So that's it from me for this week. If you found this valuable, then please give it a thumbs up so we can help get this seen by more people on YouTube. And if you'd like to see this kind of update every week, then please subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you next time.